For over 2,000 years, we've been shown the same image of Jesus: long hair, fair skin, and a serene expression, an image that's become so ingrained in our minds that we rarely question it. But what if everything you've been told about his appearance is wrong? What if the familiar face we all know is not the real one? What if Jesus, the man whose life changed the course of history, didn't look anything like the figure we've seen in countless paintings and films? Could it be that for centuries, we've been looking at a version of Jesus that was designed by artists, politicians, and cultures, not based on facts or history, but on what they wanted him to look like? What if I told you that the true appearance of Jesus, rooted in his time, his geography, and his heritage, has been concealed from us? What if we've been unknowingly blinded by an image shaped by centuries of artistic reinterpretation and cultural influence, rather than by the truth? How much of what we believe about his physical appearance has been altered, manipulated, or distorted? Today, we will take you on a journey to uncover the real Jesus, using ancient texts, modern scientific studies, and historical evidence to strip away the layers of myth and reveal a version of Jesus that's more historically accurate than anything you've ever seen. The truth might surprise you, and it could challenge everything you thought you knew about one of the most influential figures in history. Are you ready to see Jesus in a way you never have before? For centuries, the image of Jesus has been solidified in the minds of millions: a man with long, flowing hair, pale skin, and piercing blue eyes. The serene expression, the gentle demeanor, this is the Jesus we've seen in countless paintings, films, and churches around the world. It's the face we recognize, whether we're walking into a museum or flipping through a family Bible. This image is so deeply embedded in Western culture that we rarely stop to question it. But where did this portrayal come from, and how did it become the face of Jesus? The answer, surprisingly, lies in the art of the Renaissance period. During the 14th to 16th centuries, European artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael began painting their versions of religious figures, including Jesus. These artists, deeply influenced by the classical ideals of beauty, often portrayed biblical figures with features that were more European than Middle Eastern. The pale, gentle-faced Jesus we see today was largely shaped by this era, where artists used the cultural and aesthetic standards of their time to depict a figure who would resonate with the European elite. But how accurate are these depictions? How much of what we believe about the appearance of Jesus was influenced by these artistic choices, and how much of it was shaped by history? Let's take a look at the ancient texts, the records of the time, to see if they align with the traditional image we've come to accept as truth. What do the historical sources really say about the appearance of this central figure? Did Jesus truly look like the man we know from Renaissance art, or has his image been molded by centuries of cultural influence? Stay with us, as we uncover the fascinating details from ancient texts that could change how we see one of the most important figures in human history. As we turn to ancient texts, we quickly realize that the Bible itself offers very little in terms of physical description of Jesus. In fact, the scriptures are remarkably silent on what he looked like. When we think about such a significant figure in history, it's striking that the Bible never gives us a detailed account of his appearance. Instead, we find only a few indirect references that offer glimpses into how he might have been perceived by others. One such reference is found in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 53 verse 2. This passage, which many believe to be a prophetic description of Jesus, states, "He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him." This isn't the image of a radiant figure that we often see in art, no glowing halo or charismatic glow. Instead, this paints a picture of a man who was perhaps unremarkable in his outward appearance, a figure who didn't stand out in a crowd. In fact, it suggests that his physical appearance may not have been anything special at all, which is a stark contrast to the idealized versions we've grown accustomed to. But there are other sources that might offer more clues. One of the most talked about artifacts in the search for the real Jesus image is the Shroud of Turin. This ancient cloth, believed by some to have been the burial shroud of Jesus, bears the faint image of a man's face and body, leading many to wonder if this could be an actual likeness of Christ. The shroud has been the subject of intense debate for centuries. Some argue that it's the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, while others claim it to be a medieval forgery. Regardless of its authenticity, the image on the shroud shows a man with distinct, human features, no ethereal glow, no halo, just an ordinary man, bruised and battered, with long hair, a beard, and a deeply human expression. Then there are the early Christian writings, including those by the Church Fathers and apocryphal texts, which provide more symbolic or vague descriptions. These sources focus less on the physical attributes of Jesus and more on his spiritual and moral qualities. For example, in some early Christian texts, Jesus is referred to as the man of sorrows, emphasizing his emotional and spiritual suffering over his physical form. These early accounts, rather than providing a concrete picture of his face or body, point instead to the deeper aspects of his character, the sorrow, the compassion, and the humility that defined him in the eyes of his followers. From these ancient texts, we start to see a different picture of Jesus, one that isn't so easily shaped by art or cultural influences. We begin to glimpse a man who may not have been defined by physical beauty or striking features, but instead by his humanity and the impact he had on those around him. His appearance, it seems, was far less important than the message he carried and the life he led. But this raises a question: if Jesus wasn't defined by beauty or an exceptional physical presence, what did he look like, and why did we choose to imagine him as something he may not have been? Stay with us, as we continue to explore how the physical appearance of Jesus became intertwined with cultural ideals, and what that means for how we perceive him today. To truly understand what Jesus might have looked like, we must first step back in time to the 1st century, to the world that shaped him. Jesus was born in the ancient region of Judea, a province of the Roman Empire, and he lived as a Jewish man during a tumultuous period in history. His world was one where Roman rule, Jewish tradition, and regional conflicts collided, and this cultural and historical context plays a key role in how we can imagine his appearance. Jesus was not the tall, fair-skinned, and ethereally handsome figure that we so often see in Western depictions. He was a man of his time, a 1st-century Jewish man from the Middle East, a region where people typically had darker skin tones, shorter statures, and physical traits that aligned with the Mediterranean and Near Eastern populations of that era. It's important to remember that Jesus grew up in a small village called Nazareth, located in the region we now call Israel, where the climate was hot and dry, and the people's physical characteristics were shaped by centuries of intermingling with other ancient cultures in the region, including Greeks, Romans, and Persians. In the context of Jesus' heritage, it's likely that he had olive-toned skin, dark hair, and deep brown eyes, traits that were common among the Jewish people of the time. His height was probably around 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 5 inches, which was typical for men of his era. Historical records suggest that the average height of men in the Roman world was shorter than what we consider average today, with many men not surpassing 5 feet 5 inches. This means that, physically, Jesus would have blended into the crowds of Judea. He wouldn't have stood out due to his stature or appearance, which contradicts many of the tall, handsome portrayals we see in modern art. Another key aspect of Jesus' appearance comes from his Jewish heritage, which would have significantly influenced the way he dressed and styled himself. In 1st century Judea, Jewish men wore simple tunics made from wool or linen, often in natural colors. They would have also worn sandals, as shoes were a luxury, and cloaks or outer garments to protect themselves from the heat of the day or the cold of the evening. Jesus, as a Jewish man, would likely have followed these common traditions. His clothing would have been modest, practical, and reflective of the time, a far cry from the ornate robes seen in many Renaissance depictions. One important feature that many artists have missed is Jesus' hairstyle. While some modern depictions show him with long, flowing locks, historical and archaeological evidence suggests that Jewish men of the 1st century typically had short hair, often kept above the ears, in accordance with Jewish law, which prohibited men from growing long hair. Jesus likely followed this tradition, and his hair would have been kept relatively short, styled in a simple and practical way. Archaeological findings also give us clues about the appearance of men from Jesus' time. For example, the discovery of Jewish ossuaries, stone coffins, in ancient Jerusalem and nearby areas has provided invaluable evidence. These ossuaries often feature inscriptions and carvings that depict individuals from Jesus' era, showing common features like short hair, beards, and typical clothing styles. In fact, these representations often show men with rough, coarse features, indicative of the hard life they lived in an era marked by poverty and political unrest. By understanding the cultural and historical context of Jesus' time, we can begin to form a picture of what he might have looked like, a man who was physically unremarkable by the standards of his day, but whose life and teachings would transcend any physical appearance. Now that we have a clearer idea of the region and era that shaped Jesus' appearance, we're one step closer to uncovering the real face behind the myth. But there's more to this story, because the question still remains: how did we get from this historically grounded image of Jesus to the fair-skinned, blue-eyed figure that has become so ingrained in Western culture? Stay with us as we continue to uncover how art, politics, and culture redefined the image of Jesus over the centuries. As we've explored, the traditional image of Jesus has been shaped by centuries of art, culture, and religious tradition. But what happens when we strip away centuries of idealization and look at the scientific evidence? This is where modern forensic anthropology comes in, offering a more grounded, fact-based approach to uncovering what Jesus may have truly looked like. Forensic reconstruction has come a long way, especially with advancements in technology and research. One of the key figures in this field is Richard Neve, a British forensic artist and anthropologist who became famous for his work in reconstructing the faces of ancient people from skulls. In the 1990s, Neve and his team worked on a project to reconstruct the face of a typical first-century Jewish man from the region of Judea, using skulls discovered in archaeological digs. The skulls they studied were consistent with the physical characteristics of Jewish men living in that era. Shorter in stature, with thicker, darker features than what we might expect from modern European depictions. Neve's work was groundbreaking because it utilized real skeletal remains, alongside the latest forensic techniques, to create a reconstruction based on science, not artistic interpretation. Using CT scans and detailed measurements, Neve and his team were able to create a more accurate facial reconstruction of someone who could have lived at the same time as Jesus. The result was striking. This was no serene, fair-skinned figure, but a man with darker skin, a broader nose, and short, coarse hair. This man, with a rugged yet approachable face, would have blended seamlessly into the crowds of first-century Judea. But how does this forensic reconstruction compare to the common depictions of Jesus that we're all so familiar with? Let's contrast the two. In most traditional artistic portrayals, Jesus is a tall, slender man with long, flowing hair and light skin. A figure that might be more suited to a European or Mediterranean setting. His eyes are often depicted as blue, his features soft and angelic, almost otherworldly. These images convey an idealized version of Jesus, one that has been shaped by centuries of European art and the cultural influences of the Renaissance and beyond. However, the forensic reconstructions tell a different story. Instead of a tall, ethereal figure, we see a man with a stocky build, average height, and distinct facial features, reflecting the common traits of Jewish men from the time. His face is fuller, with a nose that is broader and more typical of Middle Eastern descent. The hair is short, practical, and kept close to the head, which contrasts sharply with the long, flowing locks that have become so synonymous with Jesus in traditional art. And his skin, far from the pale complexion seen in many Western depictions, would have been a darker olive tone, much more fitting for someone living in the hot, arid climates of Judea. These forensic reconstructions might surprise you. They show a man who looked much different from the idealized figures we're used to seeing in religious paintings and films. But these differences also offer a more authentic view of Jesus, one grounded in history and science, rather than artistic imagination. So why do these reconstructions matter? In a world where art and culture have so heavily influenced how we view historical figures, these reconstructions provide us with a chance to reconnect with a more realistic and historically accurate image of Jesus. They remind us that, despite the centuries of cultural reinterpretations, the real Jesus was a man of his time, living in a harsh world, with an appearance that likely mirrored those around him. As we move forward, we'll continue to explore how modern research and historical context have brought us closer to the truth, and what this means for how we see Jesus today. What do these new depictions tell us about the man, the message, and the legacy that continues to shape our world? Stay with us as we uncover more of the story. One of the most striking features of traditional depictions of Jesus is his long, flowing hair. It's an image so deeply embedded in our minds that it almost feels like an intrinsic part of who he is. But what if this image is wrong? What if the Jesus we've been visualizing for centuries, with long, luxurious hair cascading down his shoulders, isn't accurate at all? To understand why this might be the case, we need to look at the cultural and religious norms of the time. During the 1st century in Judea, Jewish men followed certain customs that directly influenced their appearance, especially when it came to hair. The Jewish tradition, which Jesus would have followed, prohibited men from growing long hair. This prohibition was part of a broader cultural context defined by the Torah, where the razor was used as a symbol of dedication to God, such as in the case of the Nazarite vow, where individuals committed to refrain from cutting their hair for a period of time. But this was an exceptional vow, not the norm for most Jewish men. Instead, the general practice for men during Jesus' time was to have short hair. Men kept their hair trimmed close to their heads, in keeping with Jewish customs and cultural expectations. The Apostle Paul even touches on this in his letter to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 14, where he writes, "Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him?" This reflects the prevailing sentiment of the time. Long hair on men was not just unusual, it was considered inappropriate for a Jewish man. In addition to short hair, there's the matter of the beard. Archaeological evidence and historical writings point to the fact that beards were very common for men of Jesus' era. The Talmud, a central text in Jewish tradition, mentions that Jewish men were expected to grow beards and refrain from shaving, as shaving was often associated with pagan practices. This is further supported by depictions of Jewish men in early Christian and Jewish art, where beards are a defining feature of their appearance. Jesus, being a Jewish man, would have likely worn a beard as well, just like the men around him. So, did Jesus really have long hair, or is this another myth propagated by art history? The evidence suggests that Jesus most likely had short hair, in line with the customs of his time, and a beard, as was typical for Jewish men. The long-haired Jesus that we often see in art isn't rooted in the historical reality of Jesus' appearance. It's a product of later artistic and cultural interpretations. This myth of long hair may have been further fueled by early depictions of Jesus in Christian art, where artists, working in a context far removed from first-century Judea, chose to portray him in a way that was aesthetically pleasing to their audiences. The long hair, in some ways, made him appear more divine, more otherworldly, emphasizing his separation from ordinary humanity. But when we strip away these layers of artistic tradition and look at the historical evidence, the image of a man with short hair and a beard emerges, an image that is more grounded in the reality of Jesus' time, culture, and identity. This revelation challenges our preconceptions, and it asks us to reconsider how much of the Jesus we know is shaped by centuries of artistic choices, rather than by the historical man who lived in the Middle East over 2,000 years ago. Stay with us as we continue uncovering more surprising truths about the real Jesus and what he might have looked like. As we've explored, the image of Jesus has been shaped by centuries of art, culture, and tradition, yet, what do the experts say? Historians, scholars, and archaeologists who have carefully studied the historical and cultural context of Jesus' time provide insights that go beyond the myth and idealization of art history. Modern scholars, especially those focused on Jewish history and the ancient world, have long argued that the traditional depictions of Jesus, particularly the tall, fair-skinned, long-haired figure, are far removed from reality. Dr. Joan Taylor, a leading biblical scholar, has written extensively on the historical Jesus. She emphasizes the importance of understanding Jesus within the Jewish cultural and historical framework of the first century. According to Dr. Taylor and others in the field, Jesus would have looked like a typical man of his time. Short in stature, with olive-toned skin, dark hair, and a beard. Scholars like Dr. Taylor remind us that much of what we envision when we think of Jesus comes from centuries of cultural reinterpretation, not from an accurate, first-hand historical account. Jewish scholars, too, contribute important perspectives. For example, scholars such as Rabbi Shmuley Batich have pointed out that Jesus was born and raised in a Jewish family and would have conformed to Jewish customs, meaning his appearance was likely consistent with the norms of Jewish men in first-century Judea. They argue that any artistic portrayal that distances Jesus from his Jewish roots distorts his identity. These scholars stress that Jesus' Jewishness is central to understanding his life, his message, and yes, even his appearance. This brings us to a key issue: cultural accuracy versus religious iconography. While modern scholars strive for historical accuracy, religious iconography has evolved over centuries to serve a different purpose. Early Christian art, particularly during the Roman Empire and later in the Renaissance, was more about theological symbolism than historical representation. The elongated, idealized features we often see in depictions of Jesus are not meant to reflect a real person's appearance, but rather to convey spiritual truths, purity, divinity, and transcendence. These images were created with the intent of evoking awe, drawing people into a mystical understanding of Jesus, rather than portraying him as he was. The iconography of Jesus evolved in response to changing cultural and religious needs. In the early Christian era, artists often drew on Greco-Roman artistic traditions to portray religious figures in a way that would be accessible and revered by those living under Roman rule. As Christianity spread across Europe, the image of Jesus continued to reflect the cultural values of those societies. In a time when Europe was undergoing its own theological and philosophical shifts, the portrayal of Jesus was altered to embody the ideals of beauty, divinity, and perfection, the very traits that Western society valued. But these images, while powerful, don't represent the historical man who lived in Judea. They reflect centuries of theological and cultural interpretations, each influencing how Jesus was seen by different cultures at different times. So why is this tension between cultural accuracy and religious iconography important? Because it shapes how we view Jesus today. For centuries, the idealized image of Jesus has been so ingrained in Western society that it can be difficult to reconcile the Jesus of our traditions with the man who walked the earth 2 millennia ago. By acknowledging the evolution of religious art and the cultural influences that shaped Jesus' image, we begin to understand that the Jesus we see in art and iconography is not the true historical figure, but a symbol, one that has been carefully crafted to convey theological and cultural ideals. This understanding deepens our appreciation of who Jesus was and why these images have persisted for so long. But it also invites us to question whether these depictions, so firmly entrenched in Western culture, are the best way to understand the real Jesus. As we continue to explore what Jesus may have really looked like, it becomes clear, the face of Jesus we've grown up with is not a historical fact, but a reflection of how the world wanted to see him, a face shaped by centuries of tradition, theology, and art. The real Jesus, as history and modern experts suggest, would have looked like a man of his time, with the features of a Jewish man from the Middle East, far from the idealized figure we often imagine. Stay with us as we delve deeper into what these evolving depictions mean for our understanding of Jesus, and how this journey can reshape the way we see not just the man, but his message as well. As we come to the end of our exploration into what Jesus truly looked like, we must take a step back and reflect on what this means for us today. While the physical appearance of Jesus has captivated the imaginations of artists, scholars, and theologians for centuries, it's important to remember that his appearance, whether we imagine him with long hair or short, is secondary to his true significance, the message he brought and the way he transformed human history. Jesus' teachings on love, forgiveness, compassion, and justice are timeless and universal. They transcend physical appearances and resonate deeply in the hearts of millions, regardless of race, nationality, or background. The fact that we've spent so much time speculating on his appearance shouldn't overshadow the profound impact his life and message have had on humanity. His teachings have changed the course of history, shaped societies, and provided hope and guidance to billions. So, what does this new understanding of Jesus' appearance mean for us? It doesn't diminish the spiritual or cultural significance of his life and work. In fact, it might even deepen our connection to him. Understanding Jesus as a man of his time, living in the real, harsh world of first-century Judea, helps us relate to him in a more authentic way. His struggles, his empathy, and his humanity become even more meaningful when we see him as a person who walked among us, rather than an idealized, distant figure. The question then becomes, how does this new picture of Jesus change the way we understand him today? Does this more grounded, historically accurate image shift our perception of who he was or what he represents? Does it make his teachings more relatable or his example more approachable? We invite you to share your thoughts and reflections in the comments. What does Jesus' appearance mean to you in your religious or cultural context? How do you reconcile the Jesus of tradition with the more historically grounded figure we've uncovered? Does this new understanding affect your relationship to his teachings? Join the conversation and let's continue exploring how this deeper understanding of Jesus' life, beyond the image we've been taught, can change the way we see him, his message, and his legacy today. In this journey through history, art, and science, we've uncovered a more authentic image of Jesus, one that challenges the long-held depictions we've grown accustomed to. From forensic reconstructions and ancient texts to the cultural context of first-century Judea, we now know that Jesus likely had darker skin, short hair, and a more typical first-century Jewish appearance. This image stands in stark contrast to the tall, fair-skinned, long-haired figure often seen in Western art. While the traditional depictions of Jesus have been powerful symbols, the real Jesus, based on historical evidence, was an ordinary man of his time, yet extraordinary in his impact on the world. If this video gave you a new perspective on Jesus' appearance, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. If you're interested in learning more about historical accuracy and religious topics, check out our related videos on ancient history, biblical studies, and the evolution of religious art. There's so much more to explore, so stay tuned. What do you think Jesus looked like? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. We'd love to hear your perspective on how his appearance fits into your understanding of who he was and the impact he had on history.